Welcome to Tech Innovation for those who have just joined us. Let's find out what are the opportunities available for the development of alternative protein through biotech and how it could increase sustainable food production and meet our nutritional needs. Should you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A feature on your screen. Your questions will be addressed during the panel discussion towards the end of this keynote. John Friedman from AgFunder will be starting today's keynote session with his thoughts on the investment trends within the food industry. John?
All right, good morning, and thanks everyone for joining us on day 2 as we dive into conversations around the future of food. My name is John Friedman. I'm the Executive Director for AgFunder and Grow Accelerator based here in Singapore. And I'm excited to be sharing with you today about some of the investment trends that we're observing in the industry to advance a more sustainable food system. First, a brief introduction to AgFunder. We're a venture capital fund manager established in 2013 and today are one of the most active early stage investors in the agri-food tech sector. In addition to our investment activities, our media channel, AgFunder News, has established itself as a go-to knowledge source for the industry with over 2 million yearly site visits and annual publications like this one, providing insights into thematic trends and the overall evolution of the sector. We've recently dug into the first half of 2021 data, and I'm happy to be sharing some of those findings with you here. So already this year, we've seen $23 billion invested across ag tech and food tech startups globally. That compares to about $30 billion for the whole of last year. This is all the more impressive when you consider that as recently as 2015, only 3% of venture capital was being invested in agri-food tech. This is for an industry that employs over 40% of the global population and upon which we all rely on for our daily sustenance. But until recently, agriculture has remained the least digitized of all major industries. Over the past few years, it's become increasingly evident that we need to be doing things differently and rethinking the way that we're producing our food, also how we're packaging it, how we're distributing it, and ultimately consuming our food. And that's where firms like AgFunder come in, built on the belief that when you combine breakthrough technologies with targeted investment and support, together we can play a material role in affecting rapid and positive change in our global food system. Since 2014, when we first started collecting data, investment into the agri-food tech sector has risen nearly 5-fold. And in the past 12 months, we've seen some big investment numbers coming out of the more established markets like China and India, and of course, the US and Europe. But most encouraging for me is the increasing deal flow and funding that we're seeing in markets like South America, or even here in Southeast Asia. Accounting for approximately 2% of the global investment pie, agri-food tech startups from Southeast Asia received just over $700 million in 2020, a material proportion of which was Singapore-led. Whilst relatively modest compared to more mature markets, this does represent a 66% increase in investment dollars and double-digit growth in deal volume from 2019. So clearly, a lot of exciting things taking place closer to home. An important trend that we've witnessed this year has been the growing number of companies exiting, reflecting a level of maturity in the market, as well as validation, of course, for investors. Admittedly, this question of where the exit's going to come from has been something of an elephant in the room, let's call it, for the ag and food tech sector for some time. But we have watershed moments to look at, such as Beyond Meat's IPO in 2019, and more recently, Oatly's public listing, which have helped to attract significant investor attention and paved the way for other next generation food companies to follow behind. This year, we've seen increased exit activity amongst companies operating higher up the value chain, driven by an urgency from incumbents to adapt and innovate their service offerings. SPACs have emerged as an exciting avenue for technology companies to go public. And we're starting to see more acquisition, between startups as well, with better funded companies acquiring other technologies that are going to be complementary to their business models. All in all, it's an exciting evolution that we're witnessing in the sector, and along with increased investment, we can see a strong path forward towards sustainability, both from a commercial as well as an environmental perspective. Another interesting shift that we've seen in the first half of 2021 is a pronounced return of investor focus back to downstream technologies, or those companies delivering solutions closer to the consumer, versus upstream, which, for simplicity's sake, let's say are those companies which are operating closer to the farm. So 2020 was actually the first year that upstream investments overtook downstream, as you can see here by the yellow bar, with strong fundraising in areas such as biotech, indoor farming, controlled environment agriculture, as well as robotics and mechanization plays. However, for the first half of 2021, we see downstream technologies raising $14 billion versus just $4 billion in the first half of last year. I guess this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. In a COVID environment with societies in lockdown, people relying more heavily on technology for food delivery, grocery purchases, and all the rest. So one of the breakout categories in downstream is what we call cloud retail infrastructure. This alone raised over $3 billion in the first 7 months this year. This sector includes technologies such as last mile delivery, as well as any infrastructure plays that a restaurant or a retailer might want to adopt to run an online business. This figure is nearly a 300% increase on the same half of last year. And obviously, this digitization trend has been accelerated by COVID. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this emerging as time goes on. Another category that we always like to track is innovative food, and particularly of interest in today's conversation. Now, this sector, I guess, mostly comprises of your alternative meats, dairies, novel ingredients, and so on. Obviously, there's been a significant surge of interest and activity here in Singapore and across Southeast Asia since the early days of 2019, when you can remember not just the 30 by 30 food campaign was established, but also we had the likes of Impossible landing on our shores, taking over the Lau Pa Sat, as well as many other restaurants around town. So the innovative food category continues to gather pace, and this year alone has raised $1.4 billion in the first half of 2021, on track to matching, if not beating, 2020's record investment haul. Indeed, of the approximate $6 billion raised by alternative protein companies over the last decade, more than half of that was received in 2020 alone, and 2021 does not look to be slowing down. The innovative food space is still largely dominated by companies out of the US, but increasingly we're seeing more diversity from new entrants to the market, one of whom we'll be hearing from shortly. So perhaps I could just, tee this up for Alex to take over. But I think needless to say, I think it's going to be a really interesting space with more exciting brands and innovative food emerging from Asia, and for good reason too. In Singapore alone, sales of free from meat frozen substitutes grew by over 26% between 2019 and 2020, and that compares to traditional meat categories growth of just about 7.5%. With such an abundance and variety of ingredients from the region, coupled with an enormous market potential, there truly is, we believe, an opportunity for Asia to be a fertile playing ground for alternative protein and novel food companies to be emerging, to tap into this expansive market opportunity, both from a commercial as well as responding to significant environmental and climate-related impact concerns when it comes to the future of our food production. Ultimately, the message that I'd like to leave you with today is, there's not only one particular segment that we should be focusing on. Obviously, AgFunder likes to operate in, and we believe it's important to be addressing the numerous challenges and inefficiencies that we can observe across the agri-food value chain. And my hope is that, whether you're a private or public investor, an operator, or a stakeholder across the ecosystem, we continue to work together, work collaboratively to really advance sustainability and force innovation and change in the food system, because ultimately our existence relies on that. And I think without further ado, I can wrap it up on the stats and hand the mic over to Alex. But first, back to the presenters. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. Almost like a tag team effort, we segue to our next speaker. We have Alex Ward from Next Gen Foods. Will explore the challenges behind the mass adoption of plant-based food alternatives and its potential for long-term diet transformation. Alex?
Thank you very much, Alvin. And thanks, John, for the intro and for that ridiculously good-looking burger that you included in your presentation. So look, the topic for me today is alternative proteins that can transform our diets. And I'd like to start by introducing some of the challenges that we are facing as an industry, as a planet, as a human race. John Tyndall, this chap that you see there on the left, and you'll see that the name is remarkably similar to our first brand. He showed that gases like carbon dioxide absorb heat. This is the fundamental the sort of premise of climate change and global warming, and this was back in 1859. So we've had a significant head start on understanding that carbon dioxide can have a negative impact. Last decade was the hottest on record. And it's the legacy food system that is a major carbon contributor. So change is really needed now, and a more sustainable approach to food is essential. It's really make or break time for all of us. Animal farming, as we all are now aware, I believe, is taking a huge toll on the planet, and it is absurdly inefficient. 70% of all freshwater withdrawals are for animal farming. This is 4.6 times the consumption of water in China. It accounts for 26% of all greenhouse gases. 40 million square kilometers of land is used for animal production. This is 4 times the size of the USA that's cleared and used for animal production. And a whopping 77 billion animals are killed annually, and that only fulfills 37% of our global protein supply. Meat production is absurdly inefficient, and we owe it to the planet and to future generations to do something about it. Now, adding to this complexity, our population is rapidly increasing and will reach around 10 billion by 2050. This is a 28% increase. And the demand for meat is continuing to grow by up to 38%. So this is already putting a huge strain on what is a broken system. So we're going to need 56% more food to feed 10 billion people. And we're already using 77% of the world's land for agriculture. So change is really needed. Coming now to the alternative protein industry, according to some recent numbers from Credit Suisse, the opportunity is going to be really, really significant. By 2030, they believe that the market for plant-based meat and plant-based dairy could be worth $143 billion. And by 2050, this could increase to $1.4 trillion. To give you an example, more tangible, in the US, the plant-based milk category has grown to around 13% the size of the dairy milk category in the last few years. And we could see very similar trends in the meat market, because at the moment, alternative meat accounts for less than 1% of all the meat consumed on the planet. But at less than 1% today, this means that meat is the target. Meat consumption is the target. And with all of that upside, there is opportunity for multiple global players. And currently, to have a billion-dollar player in the plant-based chicken market would only require a 0.3% share of chicken. And the upside could be much higher than this. So how can you build a company that can deliver on that opportunity? This is what we have done. This is how we have set up Next Gen Foods, and it's really a tech company by design with a high operational scalability, and this is needed to bring a truly measurable impact on the world for alternative protein. So we've set it up in a way to say, on the digital side, where we own and control product development and our R&D, we control the branding and we control the networks. The focus is there. Our supply chain is operated by a network of partners from procurement all the way through manufacturing, logistics, and distribution. It's a very asset-light model, which means our capital can be used very effectively. And it's designed to drive efficiency and to minimize the carbon footprint, which at the end of the day is what we are all trying to achieve. And if you compare the animal agriculture to alternative protein manufacturing, it uses 74% less land, generates 88% less greenhouse gas emissions, and uses 82% less water than animal agriculture. But to be confident in a business model, you need to have many factors aligned to build a resilient company. And we've chosen Singapore as the place to centralize many of our activities. In terms of investment, it's very well established. It's an active community, a well-educated investor ecosystem across the whole life cycle of companies, from early stage all the way through to IPO and beyond. In terms of people, we're paying very special attention to the culture, to work in a fast-moving startup with truly a mission to have a positive impact on the planet. It creates an incredible culture, and we have to make sure that we protect that and hire people that are mission aligned from the very beginning. And we're embracing the diversity. The company was set up during COVID to about 18 months ago and scaled globally with everybody working remotely, but all headquartered here from Singapore. An R&D center is going to be here, and we're going to be using all the latest tools, 3D printing, AI, to do product customization and understand where the opportunities are. And then to really have an impact for any alternative protein, investments are needed in manufacturing from an IP creation point of view and also protection. And then to scale up across the world, we need to have the trade agreements, the policies, the regulators aligned so that we can get access to all of the ingredients that are needed. But moving now to products and consumers and how we can impact diet, because this is really what it's all about. If people are not going to eat these new products, then we're not going to have the impact that we need. So I want to talk a little bit about chicken and why chicken is the biggest opportunity in alternative protein at the moment. Because it is the most consumed meat in the world, especially in Asia. It's everywhere. Consumers love it. They crave it. And we looked very carefully at chicken meat and worked out what is it that consumers love and crave that makes it so delicious, that makes it so craveable. And its texture, its taste, and its versatility. These are the three things. So from a texture point of view, we currently use soy today because it is the most available. It has the best taste. You can texturize it to have the fibers that you find in meat that is familiar for consumers when they eat it, and has the best supply chain and cost. But tomorrow, it could be pea, it could be combinations of different proteins, but there's significant research and investment that needs to be done here from a educational point of view, but also from a protein point of view. When we move to taste, we understand that taste is complex, but familiarity and cookability are critical. And we took the approach to recreate chicken fat entirely from plants that enable you to get the browning, to get the smell, the taste, the eating experience that people need, they expect and they crave and they love about chicken. And the technology now is there to do that, and it's constantly improving. And then in terms of versatility, it needs to be used in any dish, from one side of the world to the other. Chicken is so versatile, and to create a product that can be used in all of these different culinary applications is critical, and that's been done. And we started off with chefs because they have the highest expectations and demands from anybody in the world. And we feel if we can satisfy chefs with an alternative protein, with an alternative chicken that has the versatility to use across any dish that they want. And some chefs are even using it in new ways because of the way that the product has been designed to be moldable and shapeable. And so we've worked with the chefs to design these products, and the impact is really good. The feedback we're getting is really good. And we're very confident that it'll have a measurable impact on the chicken industry within the coming year or so. So just to wrap up and leave you with a thought about consumers. The average household has a meal repertoire at home of about 15 meals. And so being the new chick on the block, pun intended, is not easy. But consumers are at a very early stage of working out what they like and they don't like, what they're prepared to try or not try when it comes to alternative protein. And to break into that meal repertoire at home, or even when people go out to restaurants, is not easy. And so you have to make it appealing. You have to have a brand that draws attention. You have to have dishes and working with chefs to have things that people want to try. And to show consumers what good looks like, that there is no compromise on taste or texture or their favorite dishes, and that they can do something that's better for them from a nutrition point of view, that's better for the planet, with no compromise on taste or culinary experience. And this is the challenge that the whole industry faces, and one that needs to be invested in, all the way from governments down to universities, down to individuals, to have a positive change. And then when these products become available in the retail space, you can have a chance to break into their at-home meal repertoire. Think about your meal repertoire that you have at home. Is it more than 10 to 15? Maybe not. Ask yourself, what could I replace with an alternative protein product? And go out there and try it. I urge you all to go and try. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass it back now to Alvin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that very interesting presentation. Right now, Professor Benjamin Smith will now present how safety science is keeping pace with novel food innovations and bringing them to market. Ben?
Thanks, Alvin, for the introduction. And I don't know about everyone else, but after those last two presentations, I'm getting hungry. I need to go have a second breakfast. But if we can pop to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the future of food safety, or more the future of, or the safety of future foods. And when we're thinking about the safety of future foods, one point I want to stress is that we can't forget all of the traditional aspects of food safety when bringing products to the market. We need to look at these products with that respect and understand the pressures on the current food system with regard to things like adulteration and contamination. But really what I'm going to focus in today is how do we bring some of those new and novel foods that we've heard about to the market? How do we address this issue of improving our food security? And particularly in a country like Singapore, where greater than 90% of Singapore's food is imported, being an island state. So we have a huge reliance on new foods and imported foods. Next slide, please. So we heard from both John and Alex about some of the pressures in the food system. Alex particularly about global warming, food systems, of course, becoming more complex. There are many issues as to why this is such an important topic today. But what I would like to, if we go to the next slide, is really focus in on this aspect of three of the top sort of items where Singapore have been putting a lot of attention on how to bring new foods to the market and how can we support this, because if we can't get past these regulatory hurdles, if we can't get past the safety approval processes, we're never going to meet these goals, whether the Singapore Food Story goals of 30 by 30 or the world's goals of meeting the growing population's food needs. So what I'd really particularly like to talk a little bit about is this idea of how do we pace the regulatory and safety frameworks to the market. So if we go to the next slide, I'm sure that many of you on this call who are working in the industry, bringing new products, see what we call that's shown in these two curves, this issue of what we call the pacing problem, where innovators like yourselves are very much at the forefront of technological change, bringing these novel projects to the market. But from a regulatory perspective, because there's legislations involved, there's need to review, there's need to learn and understanding, we tend to have this little bit of a lag. And so one of the key aspects when we're trying to bring new products to market is actually say, how can we lower this curve, or how can we decrease the distance between these two factors so that we can actually make sure that new innovations hit the market in a timely manner and meet the needs of the population. So next slide, please. So what I'd really like to get across as probably my main message today to everyone working out there is that when you look at developing new foods or bringing them to the market, start the discussion early. Collaborate with the regulators and the regulatory scientists and get the discussion going. I actually came, before I came to Singapore, I came from an industry background working in safety and regulatory affairs. And in my time in the industry, one of the big approaches was very much the regulatory staff and regulatory affairs staff. We were the last gate. And so all of the innovation work would get done before. They'd come to us, and then we would scratch our heads and say, is this okay? Should it go forward? Yes or no? And it was very much a policing gate, and it was at the wrong stage of development. One of the key things when if we want to make sure that new foods get to the market the right way is we need to start talking to people like Alex up front and having the discussion as they design and bring the new products to market. And this is really one of the key things here in Singapore that has aided many of the recent product launches that have gone through. The Singapore Food Agency is actually very open to companies coming up front, sharing what you're looking to do, asking for advice, and even going in a stepwise dossier approach where you can actually give them information on a stepwise manner. And that's key because that gives them a chance to learn, them a chance to understand and actually develop the right science to bring the products to market safely for the Singapore population. And of course, regional and other areas are starting to do this as well. Okay, next slide, please. So how can we do this, and what sort of support is available here in Singapore, particularly for companies? As mentioned, I'm involved with this new platform called the Future Ready Food Safety Hub, which is a private-public partnership formed here in Singapore led by the Singapore Food Agency and A*STAR, Agency for Science, Technology and Research here in Singapore, our chief science innovation government agency. And we're home-based at the Nanyang Technological University. And the whole idea of the Fresh platform is really to give companies interested in bringing products to market here in the region or very much coming to Singapore to develop new products and build your company and product base, give you support on how to establish here from and undertake the necessary steps to meet the food safety requirements, whether that's from a registration or approval perspective, or also from the perspective of, as I said, the standard food safety issues in setting up factories and food grade requirements here. We're also very much interested in getting into the R&D side and helping fill the gaps in the novel food space and helping companies that may not have necessarily all of the resources but have definitely the great ideas bring their products to market. Next slide, please. So the focal areas are fresh, just very quickly to give you all a bit of an understanding of what is available here in Singapore. As I said, R&D is one of our key focuses, looking at how we can improve the safety frameworks and approaches to bringing novel foods to market. Talent development here in Singapore, food is a growing industry. It's a growing space. We have a lot of companies coming on the market, but we don't necessarily have the talent. We've historically been in the pharma space, other tech and engineering spaces. So how do we build that talent to support the growing field? And of course, risk communications. How do we communicate about this? How do we get consumers understanding about these products and improving their acceptance? But importantly, how does that translate back to the regulators and the government support organizations in them making their decisions around how to support the novel food space? And so it's key to have this two-way open conversation. And I said before, one of our pillars as well is consultancy to help companies coming to Singapore to plan studies, review your products, review your processes. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on what actually is needed. People can feel free to reach out to me if they do want more information. But effectively, the top line factors to think about when bringing any novel food to market is it's a little bit different than single ingredients. It is a food. It is looking at, as I said, the traditional food safety aspects. But really, when you're looking at it from a regulatory aspect as well, it's understanding the process. As much information on that, including if it's the organisms used for fermentation processes, is the quality of raw materials. Now, with some of the pressures, we're looking at things like waste material for fermentation. What factors could that introduce from a food safety perspective? What contaminants, etc.? And of course, the inherent safety or toxicity of the components. In food safety, a lot of things are driven by this component approach and the anticipated exposure. Next slide, please. So there is information available from a Singapore perspective on the SFA website for those companies that are interested in approving novel foods here in Singapore. And again, we're more than happy to help you understand this. It is very top line information, but the things that I will stress is, as with any new food or ingredient regulatory authorization, composition is key. Understanding that compositional analysis is important because it could help you avoid higher animal testing. If you can give us as much information about your product as possible, well, then we can, and scientists like myself, toxicologists, we can often get by waiving some of the heavier tests because we can use other data to support that. And of course, understanding then how some of these novel proteins and things are tolerated. So particularly in the new protein space, for proteins coming from different sources, understanding about things like allergenicity. So other considerations, of course, which we heard a little bit about from Alex, are on things like the benefits. This isn't an actual requirement for approval, but it is something that's very important when we're looking at the risk communication aspects. Okay, so next slide, I think, is my final slide. So key takeaways, safety science needs to keep pace with novel food innovations. I think everyone understands that. There is a huge opportunity here in Singapore and the region, as we've seen from John and Alex, and we're here to support that. But to do this, collaboration is key. We need the companies working with the regulators, working with the safety scientists. So on that note, final point, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or in this panel, pleased to answer what I can. And good luck to all of you who are looking to bring new products to market, whether it's here in Singapore or elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. As we will be moving on to the panel discussion, we would like to encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A feature on your screen. IPI Innovation Advisor Ramachandran Raja Manikam will be the moderator for this panel discussion. We will invite our 3 keynote speakers back on screen as well. Over to you, Rama.
Thank you, Alvin. So first of all, I think just to reiterate what Alvin said, please send your questions on the Q&A platform. We are able to answer quite a few questions, given that the speakers finished a little bit earlier. So as you know, the devil is in the details. So while we've got a very holistic picture of the landscape, we hope to be able to drill down a little bit more as we get into the questions. So while waiting for the questions, let me just kind of recap a little bit. First of all, I want to thank all of the three speakers for being very generous with the information that they've shared. But really with John, it was great to hear about the opportunity, the exciting investment trends, where the money is going, what investors would be looking for. I think that was motivation indeed for anyone who wants to look in that particular area in terms of where the future is going to be. And then I think, Alex, you brought it home for a lot of us in terms of realities of the need for alternative proteins, as opposed to it being just something nice to have. Really, I think some of the statistics you shared about the need to feed 10 billion people by 2050 sustainably, I'm sure facts like that hit home. And I think that was very helpful to motivate the rest of us who may not have been looking at it to look at this area seriously. And then really bringing it down to the realities. I think, Ben, you did a great job in sharing with us the gaps that there might be, the possibilities of what we need to do to narrow those gaps with regards to safety regulations and getting our products to market. And in all of this, obviously, the consumer is the core that they need to be able to accept taste-wise and texture-wise and want the products. So I think that was the landscape that has been painted, and I hope our audience is as enthused and excited as I am. I have been in the industry for a long while, but I learned a lot today. So given that, we have a few questions that have come in. I thought in particular, this question was an interesting one, which is actually addressed to Alex. When do you think alternative proteins will stop becoming labeled as alternative and be part of the mainstream food globally? What are the challenges to reach that milestone? Would you like to take that one, Alex?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting question, thank you. So when products are labeled or discussed as alternative protein, it's in forums like this, or in the press or in the media, because it's a headline that captures attention. When you actually go into a restaurant or you go into a supermarket, they're very much positioned in the aisles next to frozen meat products or next to fresh meat products, or on the menus, not labeled as alternative protein. So I think it's an excellent place that we need to get to in the media and in forums like this to stop calling it alternative protein. It's a wonderful point. Whoever asked that, thank you, because then it will normalize it, and consumers will start to think about it as a valid alternative, as something which does not need to be different. They don't need to eat to be different. And you know, most of us in this space where we're developing products and building brands are targeting meat eaters. We're not necessarily targeting vegans and vegetarians. Our competition here is chicken. For Tyndall specifically, for us, our competition is chicken. And we want people that love chicken and crave chicken and eat it all the time to make a different choice sometimes, but without having to compromise on, like I was talking about, the texture, the taste, and the versatility, that they can switch it out into their regular meal repertoire at home, and it becomes completely normalized. So I think that starts with us. It starts with the media. Stop trying to get attention-grabbing headlines and talk about it like it is completely normal.
Great. Thank you, Alex, for that. I thought it was a good first question to kick the panel off.
Fantastic question.
Kind of set the stage for all our mindsets to think of this as something normal as opposed to something abnormal that you're adopting into your lifestyle. So thank you for that. Having said that, there is another question. This is specific to John. So first of all, the question says, they appreciate your sharing. Do you see a significant change in the investment strategy or focus of the VCs due to COVID? How do you think Singapore startups can differentiate ourselves to catch investors' attention?
Sure. I think I tried to identify this shift that we've observed, at least within the sort of agri-food space, which we play and invest in. Obviously, one of the statistics that I shared was the shift from a focus on sort of upstream technologies, which we've seen last year, back towards downstream. And again, the rationale behind that, obviously, as we, as a society, adapt to a sort of post-COVID world where we are more heavily reliant on whether it's food delivery services or sort of cloud kitchen type solutions. If you're in the sort of traditional brick and mortar restaurant business, these more novel approaches to running a business, operating a business, and essentially getting food to the end consumer has to be considered when coming up with a solution, or if you're a startup, if you're an entrepreneur. I think one of the portfolio companies of ours in the alternative protein space, who actually launched at the start of COVID in 2020, their sort of traditional path to market was to work with food service companies and restaurants to create that buzz and the awareness amongst sort of chefs to win that consumer acceptance. Obviously, this has been a very successful strategy by some of the leading players in sort of novel protein, or not to try to repeat the word since Alex has encouraged us not to, but the alternative protein space, the likes of Impossible and even NextGen with Tyndall working with chefs to adopt their product. But I think for this particular company, Fable, out of Australia, Australia was rocked by numerous sort of lockdowns through the course of 2020, and they were fortunate to be able to work with a meal delivery service and sort of meal kit providers to still be able to get their product new into the market, but still get it to consumers. Whereas, had they relied on, brick and mortar restaurants, then obviously no one was able to dine out. So, as an entrepreneur, as a startup, I guess you have to be considering different strategies, not just in sort of product creation and brand appeal, but also how to get your product to the market, whether it's direct to consumer, B2B, B2C, etc. So that's something that I would encourage all entrepreneurs to be thinking about.
Great. Thank you, John. I thought your slides that you kind of split up the upstream and downstream where the investments go was quite enlightening. It gave us a sense for how COVID is affecting all of that. So you kind of touched a little bit on acceptance. So maybe I'll jump to this particular question, which is actually addressed to Ben, but I may invite Alex for you to add your comments later on as well. That basically the question says, besides regulatory hurdle for novel food technologies, do you think consumer perception and confidence towards novel foods is also important for accelerating market adoption? How do we influence consumers' attitudes and instill confidence?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. And as I, in a quick 10 minutes, was trying to get across, I think that a key thing really is collaboration of all stakeholders and discussion. And it's really important to have everyone on the same plate here, or at the same, sitting around the same dinner table discussing these issues, because there are many factors here. Now, from a safety perspective, the regulators, of course, are looking at risk. They want to make sure that what comes on the market is safe. But really, when we're talking about what are future foods, novel proteins, other types of future foods, what we're trying to do here is address a huge food security issue, population issue, and there are so many benefits there. And understanding what those benefits are, the benefit-risk ratio, and how that actually modulates the level of acceptance of these foods is key. And so both for the consumer and the regulator. And so we need to understand how consumers are taking to these new products, what's important from food products, and importantly, how we maintain them in a long-term diet. So what we see as well, I talked about this innovation regulation gap. It's not just regulation. Much of the work at the moment on consumer acceptance is very much on what would get someone to taste these products first off, what would get them to actually eat them. Is it like chicken, those sorts of things. But how do you actually maintain these products in a long-term diet? And that's important, whether if you're looking at food from a health perspective, which is also one of the aspects of overall safety, of course. So yes, I think benefits in consumer acceptance, understanding that, are key factors that do need to be brought into the decision process. And we need to improve the way that we actually do that, both in interacting with consumers, but then feeding that data back into the decision making by the authorities.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Alex, would you like to add?
Thank you. I think to make it a regular part of a long-term diet and get into that repertoire, then yes, people need to be aware their first experiences trying the products need to be positive from a taste point of view. The family need to give it a thumbs up at the dinner table and to enjoy eating it. But then also the cost needs to come down to parity, if not lower. And as the industry scales, that will happen. And it's not too far away from it now in many cases. But I think just to build on the regulatory thing, from a regulatory perspective, we need to have the protein sources protected. We need to have the regulatory framework around sustainable protein sources in the region. So in Asia, for Asia, all of that in place so that we can have a safe and stable supply of proteins to manufacture chicken made from plants, or whatever the next product would be, dairy products made from plants. And with that regulatory framework in place, it's going to enable that product development and that scalability to be there. And this is what's going to drive trust with consumers. That, I think, also the other element is the driving public awareness, and governments can play a role in that, to say that this is safe, to say that it is here, to educate people about the impact on the planet and on food security. There's lots of different elements to it, and we're at the beginning of this journey, but it's critical that we stick at it and work together.
I think if I could just add one comment as well, Rama. I really applaud the work that Ben's doing at Fresh and the sort of proactive whole of government support that Singapore's thrown behind this movement towards addressing not just sort of national food security issues, but ultimately trying to solve food production constraints, for the region, and hopefully, we can export these technologies and these products like Tyndall internationally. I think it's an enormous achievement when you consider how far we, as this tiny little island without much of a sort of ag or food production industry, how far we've come since 2019 when 30 by 30 was announced. And part of that, I think, is the ability or the sort of unencumbrance, because Singapore has not had sort of traditional livestock industry, perhaps with sort of vested interests, but it's the ability, with the sort of establishment of the SFA as a sort of new regulation body, etc., the ability to think outside of the box, to be able to establish a framework of regulation acceptance for an industry such as the cell-based industry. We haven't really talked about that much today, but obviously the fact that Singapore was the first country in the world to approve of cultivated meats for sale to consumers last December, and more recently, obviously their approval of a CDMO contract manufacturer operating in the cell-based space. This is truly groundbreaking technologies and adoptions and regulations that are being passed here in Singapore first globally. And that's something which, obviously the government is clearly thinking about in terms of the position of Singapore and the relevance that we play in this sort of very relevant international consideration in terms of food production for the future.
Great. Well, thanks for adding your perspectives, John. Very helpful. I think part of what I've been hearing about, the key takeaways for me were things like just even the terminology. how, and I liked what Alex said about we are not necessarily aiming only at vegetarians or vegans as an example, but we are looking at people thinking about this as a choice on the menu, as an alternative to something else. So I think some of those takeaways are, I think, very important to excite people who have not thought about going into it yet, perhaps, to think about why they should be. Which then leads me to the next question, which I was going to direct it to Ben, but I'll add a little bit up front. So the question really is for food businesses who are keen, and I assume these are traditional food businesses that are already in the domain, who are keen to venture into alternative protein, how can they begin to explore suitable alternatives for their existing products? So I guess they're looking at alternate sources. Let me just say very quickly upfront, and this is kind of a bit of a plug, if you like. But I think tech innovation is a great opportunity for you to think about. I believe there's 400 different technologies that are available for you to peruse. So that might be a good starting point. And then, of course, there are, Ben has spoken about fresh. But IPI is another resource that you might want to tap on, especially with regards to the alternative protein space, because what they do have is they have a team of innovation advisors who've been in the industry for a long time. They are up to speed with the alternative technologies and sources coming on stream, and how to help our Singapore SMEs pivot to some of these new age or new entrants or new alternatives, if you want to call it that. So these are the two that I can think of that you might want to take advantage of. But having said that, I'll hand it over to Ben if you'd like to add more to that, Ben.
Sure. No, I think, Rama, great points. And IPI is definitely a great starting point, and reach out to the experts. A lot of this is sharing knowledge and discussion and learning from each other. Specifically here in Singapore, where I can talk to, of course, there are the agencies like ESG, Singapore Innovate, those sorts of agencies that are very much invested in looking at how to support startups and companies in Singapore. The Economic Development Board, of course, EDB here in Singapore, that are looking to bring products to market. But for those, companies to the market. But for those companies that are in the space, maybe here in Singapore working, but looking for alternative changes of proteins into standard products, those sorts of things. It's very much looking at the IHLs and A-stars here on the ground, and working with organizations like the Singapore Institute of Food and Biotech Innovation, which are doing research on new types of proteins, on texturization, on taste, and pairing up with those sorts of teams that can actually help you and work with your knowledge of the food product, your knowledge of the food production process, to maybe introduce some of these new proteins. Look for new types of strains that could produce a new form of protein. Look to try and make a new protein in fermentation that tastes like fish or whatever. Reach out to the research organizations. A-STAR and the Singapore Institute of Food Biotech Innovation is probably a first good step for those that are interested.
Great.
I think just to add something to that, the government here, I absolutely agree with you, Ben, is incredibly well set up and very focused, laser focused on this sector now, with all of these different capabilities. But industry is also doing the same. When I talk to people outside of Singapore, I use the example that in the Biopolis area, you can walk within 5 minutes and be at the regional headquarters of every major ingredients company in Asia, with global networks. So you can get access to the best thinking, the best technology, the best new ingredients, and the best thinking to develop alternative protein. I just said alternative protein. To develop protein products for your business. So that just by tapping into these networks, the ecosystem is there. Just start asking questions, and it's amazing how fast you can move now.
And it is a great point to highlight not just the government too, because this ecosystem is growing and the partnerships are forming. There's also groups like the Givaudan Buehler protein centers. Other companies are forming theirs as well. There's the Temasek FTIC pilot operation, which is getting set up to look at how they can help companies. We heard about the contract development group, Escoaster and those guys. So there are other structures too in the private sector or private affiliated sector to help support this sort of growth as well.
Thank you, Ben. I apologize for jumping in because I hate to interrupt the conversation going, but we are running out of time. But having said that, I do want to take the time to thank the speakers again for being very generous with your comments and your time. I think the key takeaway message for me is it's the right time and the right place. A lot of things we can try and control, but right time and right place doesn't come every day. So let's take advantage of that and then create the ecosystem, be part of the ecosystem to look at alternative ways of meeting feeding needs of the future. So with that, I'll hand it back to Alvin, our MC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for that very engaging session. Thank you, John, Alex, Ben, and Rama, for your insights. We've come to the end of the first keynote session on what will be the future of food. Thank you for attending this webinar and your active participation. We hope that you have benefited from the insightful presentations. Please click on the info button on your screen to submit a rating out of 5 stars and your feedback before exiting this session or joining the next one. For attendees who will be joining us at our next keynote session on digging deep to meet our future food needs, we'll see you after the break at 11 a.m. Singapore time. Thank you once again.